Welcome, everyone. This is a conversation that I've been looking forward to, a conversation between Robert Breedlove and Yaron Brook. We're going to explore some big ideas here today about Bitcoin, about crypto, and about the utility of this technology. Robert is well known to Real Vision audiences, a passionate advocate of Bitcoin and host of the What is Money show. Yaron, of course, is chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute and co-author of Free Market Revolution and Equal is Unfair. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us on.
Glad to be here, Ash.
Okay, so one of the things that makes this conversation so interesting to me is that you both do many things and you come to this conversation with very different perspectives. Because we have the luxury of doing a deep dive here today, let's spend some time getting a sense of what you guys both do. Robert, you've been here many times before on Real Vision. Yaron, talk us through what you do.
So for many years, I was originally the CEO of the Ayn Rand Institute, and now for, I think, 4 years now, I've been chairman of the board. I travel around the world talking about capitalism, about freedom, about objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy. I have a Yaron Brook show, which is a kind of a YouTube podcast type show. And I've written some books. So all about kind of the philosophical foundation, really, of liberty, the philosophical foundation of freedom, and of capitalism. I also have, for the last 20 plus years, been a partner in a hedge fund. So I'm actively involved in the financial markets as somebody who manages money, other people's money. And before that, I was a finance professor, and we won't go further than that because it just gets confusing, but that's far enough. So done a lot of things. I do a lot of things, but that's kind of broadly my background and the perspective from which I come to all of this.
So give us the thumbnail sketch of what objectivism is.
So objectivism is Ayn Rand philosophy, a philosophy she articulates in her novels, Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, but then in a lot of philosophical writing she does in her nonfiction, The Virtue of Selfishness, Capitalism, Not an Ideal, and many, many other books. It's a philosophy grounded in the idea that reality is what it is. It exists. You don't make it up. No consciousness makes up reality. It exists independent of consciousness. But we do have a tool to know reality, to understand it, and to shape it to our needs. And that tool is reason. So we don't know about reality through revelation, one form of revelation or another. And emotions are not tools of cognition. They don't teach us about reality. It's reason. And then ultimately, the purpose of life is your own life. It's your own happiness. It's your own success at living. So Ayn Rand and objectivism hold a view of morality that is egoistic. It's about long-term rational self-interest. We don't believe in sacrificing to others, and we don't believe that others should be sacrificed to us. So it's a matter of treating people as traders, win-win relationships among individuals, and then that the only political system appropriate for rational, independent individualists is a free political system. That is, it's a political system of capitalism where the state is completely separate from the economy. The state doesn't intervene in economic activity. And as relevant to kind of our discussion here, I think Robert and I will agree on the fact that government should have no involvement in money. Money should be a market phenomena. It should not be a government monopoly. There should not be a central. I think Robert and I will agree on the fact that government should have no involvement in money. Money should be a market phenomena. It should not be a government monopoly. There should not be a central bank. There should be no Federal Reserve. Let's have competition and determine which money is best.
Yeah. Robert, as I said at the top of the show, you are a passionate advocate of Bitcoin. You've been on Real Vision many times in many conversations. You're also the host of the What is Money podcast. Tell us a bit about what you do and give us a sense of your position on Bitcoin and why you feel it's so important.
Yeah, sure thing. So quick background is just accounting and finance, focused entrepreneur. I've been mostly focused in tech. Was also involved in a hedge fund before deciding to pivot into education full time. And really, I have to credit that to the study of money and Bitcoin. the quote that really got me over the line with education was that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. And I think we are very close to the edge of catastrophe in multiple respects in the world today. So I'm hoping that education will help push us in the right direction. I see Bitcoin as one of the most important innovations in human history, predominantly because it's an incorruptible money, which is to say that it's the first fixed supply asset humanity has ever had. And as I'm sure we all would agree, a quick study of history will show you that manipulations of the money supply have been used to disparage and disenfranchise and marginalize people in many different ways across history. So I look at money as the base layer operating system for human action. And I think that we have basically, invented Bitcoin, but discovered something that is an incorruptible base layer on which we can build higher order applications, like what we call businesses and institutions are essentially, as I argue, applications of money. They are wealth acquisition strategies. But the fact that Bitcoin pushes us towards productive cooperation as the primary, if not sole, means of creating wealth in the world is extremely important. So it's a brand new incentive structure, a brand new game, a game that can't be rigged with rules that can't be corrupted or broken. So that's why I advocate for it so passionately.
So you're both passionate believers in open economic systems, in capitalism and property rights. The question, I guess, on the table right now, Yaron, tell us, how do you feel about Bitcoin? What's your view, and why do you feel that way?
Well, so first, generally, I think it's a amazingly interesting innovation, and it's undoubtedly going to have broad impacts on the way in which we live into the future. I think the blockchain is fascinating. It is it's a new way of conceptualizing the way in which we connect with one another and the way in which we interact with one another. And it's going to be a major force in the world moving forward. My main challenges with Bitcoin as money, to the extent that Bitcoin, and even that could be overcome if depending on how Bitcoin evolves. My main concern is that Bitcoin in and of itself, it's not clear to me is money. I don't think it is money today. If money is a common means of exchange, or the dominant means of exchange, medium of exchange, then Bitcoin is not there. Maybe it will be one day, but it's certainly not there yet. And I'm doubtful that it will become such. I think there are a number of issues related to this. I applaud the incorruptibility. I think that's a great thing. But the finite supply of Bitcoin is an economic challenge. The fact that at some point the amount of Bitcoin in the world is limited, is capped, is a challenge. I think an ideal money would match supply and demand. The supply would increase with demand, and it wouldn't be. In other words, supply would, in the context of money, supply would increase with productivity. Otherwise, you get kind of a deflation that I think is unhealthy. Not just a decrease in prices that's temporary, but an ongoing, persistent decrease in prices with the potential for real shocks as technology evolves. So I would have liked to see Bitcoin have some kind of mechanism by which the supply can increase. I also think that today, the cost is prohibitive. Now that I think can be dealt with. So I think you guys know a lot more about this in terms of the technological overlays that can be placed on Bitcoin that can reduce the transaction costs. But as it stands today, the transaction costs are high. I think you've got a big challenge overcoming just the network effect that money already has, that dollars and, what we would consider corrupt money already has. And I don't think that networking effect, yes, you can overcome it through education in a sense. You can teach people how corrupt their money is. But if reality hasn't taught them bouts of hyperinflation and all the BS that is revolved around money for so long hasn't taught people, I don't see Bitcoin teaching that. So I think overcoming the network effect that existing money and the cheap transaction costs and the ease of using that money is going to be difficult. But the thing I think that ultimately is going to prevent Bitcoin from becoming money is government. I just don't think government is going to allow it. Now, it would be nice if we lived in a world where government wasn't a factor. Then I think other factors would determine whether Bitcoin was money or whether something else was money. I think Bitcoin has it needs to develop, Bitcoin needs to develop some other use other than as money. And maybe that's in the cards. Again, you guys are the experts. Maybe you can overlay smart contracts, or you can overlay some other use of the Bitcoin blockchain other than as money. But it needs that. Otherwise, if it's just money, it needs some anchor that anchors it to a particular value. Right now, it has no such anchor. But as I said, the real problem is government. As long as we have governments, and as far as I know, we have them, as long as they intervene in the economy, and they certainly do that, as long as they're central banks, and I don't see them going away anytime soon, they won't allow it. They will, I believe, governments will do anything it takes, including shutting down the economy if that's what's required, in order to destroy any kind of viable or that they think is a viable alternative to a dollar or to a fiat currency. The way in which governments control the economy, the way in which they control our lives, is to a large extent through control of the monetary system. It's not going to be easy for them to give that up.
Robert, sounds like Yaron is open but skeptical about Bitcoin. Jump in, give us some thoughts.
Well, I think you lay out a lot of good points, Yaron, and we agree. Essentially, we agree that the world needs sound, hard, honest money. I think we also agree that our opinions are not so much relevant as what the market decides. Right? The market, as with every other technology, should be left unrestricted, uninhibited, unencumbered to select the best tool for the job. And I think, with money specifically, I'll speak to the fixed supply point because I know you're an advocate for free banking as well. And I think that this commonly gets misunderstood, that because Bitcoin has a fixed supply, a hard cap, that it has basically absolute inelasticity. A Bitcoin standard world would have no elasticity in the money supply. But I actually think that free banking is the augmentation necessary for that. So if you had free banking, banks would be free to compete, issue their own, currencies of any type, redeemable for whatever they want. And they would effectively be trading on their own reputation, right? If they overissued, if they, got too deeply into a fractional reserve and customers called their bluff, they redeemed and converted that money or pulled their money out of the bank, then the banks, as Buffett says, when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked. So free banking would quickly establish what I think would be full reserve banks. Ultimately, I don't think fractional reserve banks would operate in any lasting sense. Perhaps they would come into being in times of crisis, giving that elasticity to money that many people think Bitcoin would be inhibitive to. But the hard cap and the convertibility is very important. The reason we're in the situation we're in is because people were given a contract to gold, which was the dollar, and that contract was gradually violated and then ultimately rescinded. And today, fiat currency, as I've described it previously, is just this uncollateralized debt certificate undergoing slow motion default while its use is forced on all of us. So the consequences are really, really bad. People don't even have recourse to good money, absent Bitcoin, in my opinion. So I think free banking actually resolves the hard cap issue. To speak to the network effects, I agree with you. The network effects of the dollar and gold are extremely strong. Gold has a 5,000 year head start. The dollar has not only I guess it inherited some of the credibility from gold is maybe one way to look at it, but then it also has this legal tender, capital controls, this legal infrastructure compelling it and protecting it. So that's a very potent network effect. The thing I think is working in Bitcoin's favor in this respect is that fiat network effects ultimately self-destruct. This is another very common denominator across history is fiat currencies fail. When you're not tethered to economic reality in any way, and you are effectively an authoritative body that has virtually limitless access to resources by printing money, you end up running that mechanism until it self-destructs. And I think we're getting closer to that every day here in the US dollar standard in 2021. As far as government stopping Bitcoin, I agree with you. Bitcoin is the ultimate enemy of the state in a lot of ways. I view it more as a technology as transformative as the printing press itself for a lot of reasons I've outlined. I think, again, by swapping out that base layer protocol for human action, it's transformative to all the institutions and organizations we build on top of it. So I think the coercive state that we've become accustomed to and the central bank, these all transform as a result of Bitcoin. The big question in government stopping it is how. No one's cracked this nut. There's been very extreme examples given of waging total war on the electric grid and shutting down the economy. But these things are self-defeating too, right? If you're going to have a productive tax base and generate revenues, then you need economic activity. You can't just cut off your nose to spite your face, so to speak. So I think governments will ultimately adopt the path of least resistance, which is just to buy Bitcoin. And the game theory is actually structured in a way that there are heavy incentives to be the first to sit down at that table, as we're already seeing El Salvador do today. I think we'll see other countries adopt a similar strategy. And then just to the last point of Bitcoin needing to do something else, I think this may be a key point of disagreement because I actually think Bitcoin is the first money in history that's pure monetary premium without any industrial utility whatsoever is an advantage. We look at gold's market cap of roughly $10 trillion. Say 80% of that is reservation demand as money. 20% of that is utility in electronics or dentistry or whatever. Bitcoin's pure monetary premium. It's the first pure monetary technology that's ever been invented. And I think this is part of the reason it's so hard to get our head around it. And as far as its anchoring goes, it's anchored into the real world through the energy markets. And ultimately, I think that's what money is. It's a proxy token for the productivity gains we develop under the division of labor, which is the excess energy we're creating through capital accumulation. So it's a lot, it's really transformative to our worldview. It's not something we've ever had historically. And I think it speaks to this larger transformation into the digital age, which I also view as similarly transformative as the transformation from agricultural into the industrial age. So I'll leave it at that.
You're on a lot of points there. I'm curious to get your response, particularly the point that Robert made about fractional reserve banking. Give us a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of what fractional reserve banking is for folks who don't have PhDs in finance as you do, and give us a bit of a sense of the role that it plays in the modern Western economies.
Sure. Fractional reserve banking is the idea that what banks do when you deposit money in the bank. Let's say you deposit money in a bank in a savings account. Well, in that case, you can't access that money, let's say for a year. So it's locked up for a year. Then the bank would lend it out for a year. And there's a complete match between your getting the money a year from now and the loan being repaid to the bank a year from now, right? So there's no fractional reserve banking going on. But what happens when you open a checking account and you put money in that is not locked up? It's just there, and it's there for you can take it out whenever you want, right? Supposedly. Now, if you notice the fine print when you sign up for a checking account, it actually says there that the bank has the ability to lock you out of your account for a certain period of time if they face certain challenges about paying you back. But what happens with checking accounts is the bank doesn't just sit there. Let's assume money was really gold, and you come and you deposit a little bag of gold in the bank, and they don't just hold on to that gold and wait until you want to withdraw it. They take that gold in a sense, and then they lend it out. And they don't lend all of it because in the modern banking system, we have regulations that restrict how much of it they can lend out. In the world in which we live today, about 10% they have to hold. So for every $100 you deposit at the bank in a checking account, they have to hold about 10. The rest they can lend out. And when you come and withdraw your money, they either take it from some other account, or they borrow it in the overnight banking markets, or they borrow it from another bank, or they borrow it from the Fed, or they borrow it from somewhere, or, if their reserves are not enough to cover what you're taking out. So in other words, for every $100 you put in, only 10 is kept. 90 is lent out. Now think about what happens to that 90 that's lent out. And I'm sorry if this gets a little complicated. It's not really. If I had a blackboard, it would be a little easier to explain. The 90 that gets lent out is deposited at some other bank, right? It's lent to Robert. And Robert goes to his bank and deposits $90. Now that bank keeps 9 and lends out 81. And you can see how this goes on and on. So for every $100 basically that's deposited, the banking system has the ability, given our legal structure today, to create $900. So there's a 9x multiplier on every dollar that is put into the market. And of course, they don't actually do that. The amount of money created is some number less than that. And right now, because the demand for loans is so low, because the velocity of money is so low, people are not demanding that money. There's very little lending going on, so the multiplier is much smaller than that. But for every dollar deposited in the banking system, theoretically, 9 are created. And that gives you flexibility, right? When there's huge demand for loans, you don't have to print new money, theoretically, or you don't have to find new gold. The money, the banking system is going to absorb it through fractional reserve banking by creating more loans, which creates more money. When loan demand shrinks, that contracts. So there's a certain contraction and expansion that happens within the banking system without new gold reserves being discovered to expand the amount of underlying monetary base. This is on a gold standard. Today, it's how much the Fed prints, or how many bonds the Fed buys and puts money in a sense, or how many zeros and ones the Fed creates in banks' checking accounts to create new money. So that allows for that flexibility. Now, now in a free banking system, and Robert and I agree completely about free banking. There should be free banking. The beauty of a free banking system, and again, I agree with Robert, is we don't have a debate about whether Bitcoin becomes money or not. Bitcoin either becomes money or it doesn't. Now, I happen to believe it wouldn't. And Robert believes it would, but who cares what we believe, right? We care because if Robert's right and we're heading towards free banking, then everybody should be investing in Bitcoin. If I'm right and we're heading towards free banking, Bitcoin's overvalued, maybe, depending on its other uses again. So and it depends on the path to get there, because Bitcoin might have value between now and free banking. Even if under a free banking system, it has a value of 0, the path might not be down. The path might be up a lot and then down, because I think Bitcoin's main value today is in a mixed economy, is in the more authoritarian the world becomes, in a sense, the more valuable Bitcoin becomes. Indeed, in a free market, I'm not sure Bitcoin's worth anything. So I don't quite buy this pure monetary premium. So I don't completely agree on that. And that's why I think in a free banking, in a true free banking, we'd have competition. I think you'd have a digital currency anchored in gold. So like a stable coin, in a sense, anchored in gold. But I don't know. Maybe it'll be anchored in something else. But I do believe that any digital currency has to be anchored in something. So in that free world, I think that you would have a variety of different banks. Some banks would be like Robert described them, 100% reserve banks. And they would offer you 0% on your checking account because they couldn't lend it out. So they couldn't make any money. Indeed, you might have to pay them to hold on, to be, in a sense, your wallet, right? Your digital wallet to preserve it and to create some kind of security around it. And then there might be some fractional reserve banks where if you deposited money with them, you took some liquidity risk, and they might pay you interest to get your money. And again, the market would determine the level of fractional reserve. I don't consider, some libertarians out there consider fractional reserve banking fraudulent. I don't consider it fraudulent. It's a contract. You sign a contract. You can either deposit the money at the bank or not. I mean, certainly it's a fraud today, but fiat money is a fraud today. The whole system is a fraud today. So yes. But in a free banking system, different banks, and this happened before 1933, when the government confiscated all the gold in the world, all the gold in the U.S., different banks had different fractional reserves, and some banks were 100% reserve banks. Other banks were less. No bank really went below 50 or much below 50, maybe 40. No bank went to 90%, which is what to 10%, which is what it is today. 10% reserves, 90% fraction. That's a creation of government that couldn't exist in a free banking system. So the levels of reserve would be significantly higher, likely. But there'd be different banks offering you a different product with a different risk premium, and we as customers would choose. And as Robert said, the market would determine, not talking heads, right? Not the experts, but the market would determine that. So I think the long run, if indeed we're heading towards free banking, I do believe we are. It's just a question of how long. I think it's going to take us longer than what you guys might think.
You talk about free banking, and obviously there was a free banking period in the United States from sometime in the late 1830s until the Civil War. At least that's how it's traditionally defined. Give us your sense on what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've never had free banking. Let's just be clear about that, right? The federal government has always tried to manipulate the underlying currency. So, they would switch between gold and silver, and what was the legal tender and the exchange rate. And so they've always mucked around with money, right? Money is too important and too powerful in a sense for the government to unless you have a constitutional amendment that bars them from doing it, to avoid mucking around with it. So during all of these periods, you've always had the government interfering with it. So even the 1836 to the Civil War period is not a pure free banking period. The only pure free banking system I think we've had was actually in Scotland during that period, and it was destroyed by the Bank of England that refused to allow it. Right, it was too successful, and the Bank of England came in and took it over. But in the U.S., what happened? In Scotland, what happened is basically you would go to the bank with gold, which was basically money. The bank would issue you notes, dollar bills, but the dollar bill would be from the bank, not federal dollar bills. They would be from the bank, exchangeable into X ounces of gold. So every dollar was exchangeable into, I can't remember the amount, but so many ounces of gold, right? And indeed, the dollar means, a certain weight of gold, right? That's what the word means. That's why the money was named that way. And so the banks would do this, and so different notes would be from different banks. Different banks would have different reputations. So let's say Citibank, which has always been a shitty bank. Citibank had a low reputation. Everybody would discount. They'd say, Citibank dollar, maybe not worth real dollar. Maybe it's worth something less than that. And there would be exchanges between banks. It was not as efficient as it would be today in a digital world. And I agree with Robert that the digital revolution is as big as the equivalent to the industrial revolution, or even to manufacturing, just going from into manufacturing. And it works, right? So if a bank wants to attract customers, it needs to attract gold. It needs to offer you good terms, either good interest rates or good, some kind of good service or something and then loans are made. Again, those loans are based on gold. Gold will move from banks to banks through clearinghouses as checks or cash is cleared through the different ways. So if I give Robert a Citibank dollar, he deposits it at the Chase Bank. Chase then sends that dollar bill to Citibank. Citibank sends Chase the gold. I mean, again, this was somewhat cumbersome in those days. And that's part of why there was no free banking, really. Throughout American history, banks have not allowed to consolidate. So they've always been lots of little banks. And there's never been a national bank in the United States in terms of branches in every state, really until the 1990s when Bank of America branched out. Bank of America used to be restricted to only being in California. So the history of banking in America is a history of regulation.
Let me jump back to Robert here. I wanted to ask about a question or a point that you raised, Robert. You used the phrase sound, hard, honest money. What does that phrase mean to you, and why is it so significant from a macroeconomic perspective in your view?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but you could sum it up with what the market selects as money, effectively. The market, voluntary market action will favor the money that is least vulnerable to inflation. right? And this is obvious. If you own a share in a company, you don't want to give one shareholder in that company the arbitrary ability to print more shares and dilute the value of your holdings in that company. And you could look at money the same way. Money is basically a share in global capital stock. To give one entity or one individual the asymmetric ability to produce new shares and dilute everyone else is nonsensical. Yet that is what the government has been able to impose through the threat of force, effectively. And I'd like to speak a bit to fractional reserve banking. So I agree that, as I said, it could emerge on the free market. If there's an outsized demand for money, and if we're on a Bitcoin standard or even a gold standard, if the supply were an issue, right? If it were too limited, then I actually think the market would, the interest rate would increase. This would give banks an additional incentive to issue additional currency supply or money supply. But I think fractional reserve banking, to the extent that it is non-consensual, right? If you don't sign up for that liquidity risk that you described, it is an absolute fraud, right? It's an outright violation of your property rights. If I put money in a bank and we've contractually agreed that you hold my money one for one, you give me a currency to make it more transactable, but I can redeem it at any time. As soon as you rescind my option to redeem or convert that money, you have violated contract law. It's a violation of my property rights.
If that's the contract.
If that's the contract. So that's where I would say fractional reserve banking, to the extent that it's not consensual, is an outright fraud or violation of property rights. Property rights, and I think this ties into objectivism nicely. Ayn Rand said that property rights are the basis of all human rights, right? You can't have any human rights without the ability to store the value of your labor over time. And specifically here, I like to define this as that property is the integrity of the relationship between owner and asset. It's not any one thing. It's just, if I have expended my labor in the world to create value, it's how tight is my relationship to that thing that I've created, which again would be violated in a non-consensual fractional reserve banking situation. And so I actually, to speak to Bitcoin on this, I think Bitcoin is the first implementation of this ancient idea of inviolable property. This was listed in the Magna Carta in the 13th century, that we're supposed to have the right to life, liberty, and basically inviolable property. The problem has always been, how do you implement that? Because we can scribble it on a constitution or a government founding document, but governments have every incentive to disregard that over time, which indeed they have. So I actually, and this may be a stronger view, I'm not, admittedly haven't read enough Ayn Rand yet, although she is very high on my list. I think the state, all government and state action is a misallocation of capital. Basically, anytime you're invoking coercion, right, or you're violating consent, you're withdrawing productive factors from the marketplace to pay for that action, whatever it is. This is what taxation and inflation is. So I think the big monkey on the back we've had across history is this coercive element called the state. And for the first time in history, we have created a property right that's independent of the state. We don't need the government to enforce Bitcoin as property in any way. The mining network provides this service for us at a much more cost-efficient way. And so if you look at that, if you look at the state as a business, which everything is a business, its business model is the securing of property rights, the securing of relationship between owner and asset, but it's also the revenue model also comes in violating those very property rights that they're ostensibly formed to protect. So with Bitcoin, we have this monetary property right independent of the state monopoly on violence and coercion. And I think that is really, really important, right? It's serving a role that gold did historically, where gold was kind of this, analog regulator of government. If you were irresponsible in your country with monetary policy, gold would flow out of your country, which also explains why governments have cornered the market on gold through central banking, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas Bitcoin is something you can't monopolize. You can't stop the flow of Bitcoin out of your organization or out of your country in the same way that you can gold. So this is where the real promise of Bitcoin shines, and that it is, promises to be the separation of money and state. And I think Ayn Rand would support that. I think she would be all for the removal of monetary property rights from the purview of the state.
Robert, let me ask you a devil's advocate question. For those who would say this sort of system that you describe sounds vaguely dystopian here in 2021 in the United States, I don't walk out of my apartment in fear that government agents are going to throw me into the trunk of a Buick. I have a reasonable sense that my property is secure. Give us a sense of why you feel this is so urgently needed.
Well, again, if you just study the history of money and how fiat ends, it ends in a collapse of the monetary network, a collapse in trust. And when trust collapses in that way, I mean, we can look at Venezuela today, right? When the money fails, you are then restricted to operating with people that are only within your circle of trust. And, we're all limited by the Dunbar number here. So 150 people? We relate to the other 8 billion people on Earth.
This is the number of people you can have relationships with in a small society.
Yeah, on a first name basis. Yeah, exactly. So money is how we scale trust. Fiat currency is a money that is designed, I would argue, designed to self-annihilate. You're basically giving the authoritarian or the government or the state an option. They have a call option on the collective savings of civilization via inflation. And they've arrogated themselves that option because it's a business, right? If you're building a business, you want to increase revenues and profits. What's the best way to increase revenues and profits if you have a monopoly on violence? Well, it's control the money. So although you could argue, Ash, that things are safe and sound in New York today or wherever you're at, don't mean to be presumptuous, I would say that they're probably less safe and sound than they were 5 years ago. And a lot of that is tied to the expansion of the money supply. And it doesn't go the other direction, right? Fiat currency just gets worse until it gets so bad that we have to install something else or switch to a different monetary standard or some other way to scale trust. So I think that this is one of those lessons humans have repeatedly learned across history, that we cannot print money to solve problems. But every 3 generations or so, it seems like we forget it and we try it again. So with Bitcoin, at least, we get this permanent implementation of this ancient principle of inviolable property that in a way saves us from ourselves. It's preventing self-deception through fiat currency expansion.
I'm curious, Yaron, you spend a lot of time thinking about these philosophical issues. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a lot, right? So first, I don't view government as business because I think that's not fair to business. Because business is about making money. Business is about, and the way to make money in a free market is by creating value. Modern government is not about creating value. Modern government is about power.
But
and it's about using that power. What's that?
They take value.
Exactly. They're destroyers of value. They're not creators of value. So I think it's wrong to view government as a business because I think that reflects badly on business. Government is about power, and it's about the use of power, political power. Political power is very different than economic power. Economic power is the power of voluntary exchange. As Robert said, whatever's in a contract, but that's a voluntary interaction, right? Nobody here is, I'm certainly not advocating for fractional reserve or anything else as fraud, right? As deception. It's a question of what does the contract say? I'm just saying, I think in a free banking system, there'd be a variety of contracts. But going back to government, I believe government is necessary. Ayn Rand was very strong on the idea that government was necessary, not a necessary evil, but a necessary good. It's just we've never gotten it right. And that's not surprising. The human race as a philosophical being is very young, right? In of the hundreds of thousands of years human beings have been on the planet Earth, we've been thinking philosophically about these kind of ideas for maybe 2,500 years, not a very long time. And most of those we've been subjugated by religion. So not really thinking that much. So, we're pretty young in terms of figuring all these things out. So I wouldn't condemn us because we haven't gotten it right yet. I wouldn't condemn the concept. Government is there to, the proper function of government, a proper government, is there to eliminate force from society, eliminate coercion from society. And again, I agree with Robert. As a consequence, it cannot have the revenue model that it has. The revenue model that says that the government can just arbitrarily, by use of a gun, take our money whenever it wants to, is immoral, unsustainable, and just evil, and it leads to the corruption of government. So there has to be some way to create a voluntary means for raising government revenue. Now, what are those means? I can speculate, but it's like free banking. I'd rather see how it evolves and when we get there and see how it does it, but it has to be voluntary. It cannot be coercive. As soon as it becomes coercive, government loses its legitimacy.
Let me jump in also and ask a devil's advocate question for you as well, Yaron. I have a libertarian streak in me as well, and if you catch me after I've been waiting in line for 4 hours at the DMV, I'm pretty ticked off. But this idea that government is just purely subtractive. So there are functions that seem beneficial to economic development that government provides, and I'll just list a couple. An interstate highway system is a useful thing when you want to get around. It's useful to have weights and measures being standardized, police and fire departments, emergency services, ambulances regulated. I mean, these are some things that most people in the 21st century find to be helpful to not just commerce, but their day-to-day existences.
So most people are wrong most of the time, for whatever that's worth, right? So the fact that most people think anything is meaningless, but let's take those quickly.
But Yaron, how do you square that? How do you square that then with how do you square that with democracy?
I don't, right? I'm not particularly pro-democracy. I'm not pro-authoritarianism either. I'm pro-freedom, which means that you have a government that has very little power. So that you can't vote to take away my rights. You can't vote to take away Robert. Robert can decide whatever he wants is money. Nobody can stop it from doing that. Nobody can control him. So you give government a limited power, and you use democracy to elect the representatives, but the representatives have very, very, very constrained power. This is the view of the founding fathers. They were not democracy advocates. They were very suspicious of democracy. You read Madison. They thought that democracy was corrupting and always led to corruption. And as a consequence, they try to separate politics from the voters as much as possible. And then they try to limit and constrain the ability of politicians to do stuff as much as possible. So they created a system with as many opportunities for gridlock as possible. Given the system we have, which is not as good as it should be, I'm a huge believer in gridlock. I love it when the parties disagree. It scares the hell out of me when Republicans and Democrats agree on anything. That is when you run for the hills. So let me say, you mentioned highways. I don't know, ambulances. I mean, ambulances are private even today. Ambulances should be private. The last people I want managing my healthcare is the government. I want competition. I want innovation. I want the best potential product that's possible, and that you're not going to get with a coercive system generated from the government. Highways, the original highways were all built by private enterprise. There's no reason the highway system cannot be privatized. Indeed, all the land in the U.S. should be privatized. Currently, 70% of the land west of the Mississippi is owned by the state. It shouldn't own anything. Not a centimeter of land should be owned by the state. It should all be privatized, including the highways, and no reason not to. Yes, there's some role in standardized weights. Maybe the government can have a weight division and says, this is what a meter looks like. And then if people don't want to use it, they don't have to use it. Now, it would be a fiasco if people didn't, and they'd learn to use a particular standard. I don't think that's a particularly important role for government. Standards arise from the marketplace. Look at all the tech. Look at all the standards that exist today in tech. The government didn't invent those. The market did. I mean, programmers got together at conferences and stuff like that and said, like, there's a standard for Ethernet. There's a standard for video online. All of those standards were created by the leaders in those industries getting together and negotiating and coming up with what made sense for the industry. And then if somebody didn't want to play by those rules, they were happy to try not to play by the rules. So, and you could go on and on. Police, yes, police is the one function government has to be responsible. Police, the judiciary, and the military are the only functions that you need government for. That's it. The things that involve force, anything that involves coercion, that's where the government steps in. It's a monopoly over the use of force. I can't, the whole point of the government is to prevent me from, destroying your property or beating you up or stealing your stuff. Bitcoin can help, but it can't guarantee property completely, because much of property is in the physical world. It's not in the digital world. It can secure digital property, but it can't secure physical property. So you still need some entity, government in this case, to secure at least physical property. And I think ultimately, and maybe I'm out of my technological competence here, but I think also in the digital world, you need some function of government, at least to set the standard about what security means in terms of private property. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm open to the possibility that there are ways to do it without government intervention.
Yeah, let's throw that one back to Robert, since Robert spends a lot of time thinking about this technology. Robert, what's the role, if any, of government in your view in this space?
I think the state does not need to exist whatsoever. But let me qualify this a bit. So we'll go back to everything as a business, which I do think every human organization is a business, full stop. I do agree with Yaron, though, that markets create value and wealth by making. It's a positive sum game. We're trading with one another and exchanging voluntarily to accomplish greater results with less effort. Whereas the state business model is not creating value. It's actually a zero sum game. It's taking. So markets are making, the state is taking. That's how they generate value for themselves. That's how they enrich their shareholders. When the US dollar supply is expanded, central bank shareholders are enriched. That's taking. There's no making there. There's no added economic value. You could analogize this to like a hunting or farming business, right? When you go out and farm plants, it's like you're not adding value to those plants necessarily. You're harvesting them, or you're hunting animals. You're killing them to eat them. You're taking from the plants and animals. That's how the state treats taxpayers. I think that, so to the point that force is necessary to be wielded by the state in any area where force or coercion is involved, I don't think that's a really good strategy for reducing coercion. Like it works, right? You can have the threat of force, which will inhibit people from using force, but I think incentives are much better. And this goes deep into this literature about the logic of violence and the economics of violence, and how innovations have changed our relationship with force and our institutional forms over time. And that's one way to look at Bitcoin, is that it's just such a defensive technology that it's so expensive to steal or attack Bitcoin that it basically incentivizes humans into more productive trading relationships and away from taking relationships. So I also agree that, we're growing up, right? We're kind of a young social animal still. The way I look at this is maybe the state was a natural progression of our evolution. Like for the same reason, when your child is young, you might wield force over them. You're going to spank them or give them the threat of spankings here and there. But as they get older and more mature, you're going to end up negotiating with your teenager, right? You're not going to spank your teenager. So I think human beings are kind of going through this evolutionary process as well. Maybe we needed the state as a disciplinarian force historically, but going into this digital age,